Fossils. Written by Robert A. Webster. Narrated by Robert A. Webster. Prologue. Great Britain was in the throes of a musical evolution. A new and exciting band had emerged, with a unique brand of music that had captured the hearts and imagination of the nation. Although it had only been several weeks since the pop sensations had burst onto the music scene, they had swept through the airwaves with a fresh sound that attracted both old and young alike. Already dubbed as the New Beatles, they were taking the music world by storm and putting British music back on the musical map. The media named their unique sound tenor rock, and everyone knew the band as Fossils. Fossils had won a national competition several weeks earlier, which had brought them to the attention of a major record and broadcasting company that propelled them into the nation's spotlight. Their debut album had been an instant success, and their music made a refreshing change to the chart-topping humdrum of the time. The company successfully hyped the band, giving the British population a focus in these dismal days, and the country was gripped by Fossils fever. There was, however, one problem. The Fossils had never been seen, and apart from their manager, nobody knew anything about this reclusive four-man band. This added to the band's mystique, and the press played on the fact. Some offered rewards for information, which heightened the hysteria. Fossils had a distinctive sound. They had a varied range, from soft ballads to thumping rock songs. They performed ballads with a melodic, haunting sound, and their rock numbers were played and sung with gusto, making them the total package with wide appeal. The lead vocalist had a strange, yet unique voice, with perfect pitch and tone. It was the maturity of their sound that led many to believe this was an older band, but the media assured the nation's audience that they were a young, vibrant pop group. The major record and broadcasting company promoted the band, and their success had surpassed expectations. They had given out just enough information to keep the country's interest, but never divulged too much about the band, because they themselves knew very little. Only the Fossils manager knew the truth behind the band, but he had no intention of revealing that secret. Rumours and speculation abounded for several days about the band making an appearance. Finally it was announced by the media that a press conference would be held. On the day of the broadcast, everyone was glued to their radios and televisions. The nation waited with bated breath for the eagerly anticipated conference to begin. Track 1. Several months earlier. It was a warm summer's afternoon when the van arrived and loaded a Steinway grand piano into the recreation room. Throughout the day, elderly residents came and admired the piano, inquisitive about who was due to move into Albert's old room. 3 in particular were excited by the arrival of this fine musical instrument and couldn't wait to meet its owner. The following day, a BMW came up the driveway. A middle-aged man and woman got out and accompanied a slender, well-groomed elderly man into the residence. The curtains twitched as the old folks looked on excitedly at their new neighbour. John and Lorraine spent an hour with Mrs. Chew, the warden, while she explained to Charles the rules and regulations. Charles wasn't paying much attention as his mind wandered elsewhere. Mrs. Chew took the small group to a room on the ground floor, which had already been laid out with Charles's belongings, his old armchair and other small mementos. Mrs. Chew then advised John and Lorraine to leave him to get settled in. They said their farewells and left Charles deep in thought, staring out of the window onto well-manicured lawns. His room smelled like the rest of the place, which for Charles wasn't a homely aroma. It was the eggy, musty smell, usually associated with old people's homes. His thoughts wandered back and he reflected on his memories. Charles reminisced about his childhood and growing up around the entertainment business. His mother was an opera singer, and he picked up a love for the piano at an early age. His father was disappointed by his son's chosen interest, as he had expected him to follow him into the military. Charles was 10 years old when his father died, and he and his mother had been well provided for. Charles pursued a music career, and although he loved the piano, his passion had been singing. He had a perfect tenor voice, but unfortunately he had a deformed vocal cords, which had been untreatable at the time, which gave his voice a gravelly sound, unsuitable for opera or any other type of classical music. Charles was employed by the Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra as a pianist after leaving university. Charles was 22 when he first met Mary. She had auditioned for a violinist position in the orchestra, and although she never had any musical qualifications, she was a natural violin player. Charles noticed this pretty young blonde, as she played a Caprice No. 24 in A minor. He could tell that Joseph Fletcher, the orchestra leader, was impressed, and with Charles's prompting employed Mary. Charles had chased Mary from day one, and after a short courtship they married. Mary hailed from Cleethorpes, where they decided to buy property for their future. They bought a piece of land on the outskirts of the seaside town and had a large 5-bedroom house built. Charles finally got his big break when he was offered a position in the prestigious London Philharmonic Orchestra. He realised he would be touring a great deal, so Mary decided to leave the Liverpool Philharmonic and tour with Charles. However, she became pregnant shortly after their first tour and had their first child, John. Charles spent the next few years touring alone, while Mary remained at their Cleethorpes home. She gave birth to 2 more children, first Lorraine and then a year later Peter. The years passed and Charles was constantly away on tour. Here Mary decided that although the money Charles earned kept the family comfortable, he did not want to be like his father and miss out on his children's important years. He got a job at Cleethorpes Grammar School teaching music. He remained there for many years until finally retiring. Here Mary planned to live the remainder of their lives together, watching their family grow in the tranquility of their home. Their children had families of their own and life was idyllic for Charles and Mary. They'd spend their days either in each other's company or with family members. The evenings would be spent with Charles playing his piano and Mary accompanying him on her violin. They led a serene and happy life until the ravages of leukemia took Mary and Charles's world fell apart. Mrs. Chew knocked on the door, interrupting Charles's thoughts, and informed him that the afternoon meal would be ready at 6 p.m. Charles didn't feel hungry, so he ignored her, relaxed back into his chair and recalled the terrible events that had led him to this current situation. It was a warm summer's day in the Lincolnshire countryside. Charles sat in the front row of the crematorium small chapel, surrounded by his children, grandchildren and other family members and friends. There was silence as the coffin slowly moved down the conveyor into the furnace, and the local vicar gave his sermon for the safe journey of Mary's soul. Then it was over. Charles was devastated, and although surrounded by his loving family, he felt alone. During the wake at Charles's house, John put his arm round the sad old man. "Dad," he said, "remember what Mum told you about what you should do when this day happened?" Charles looked at his son and replied, "Not now, John. Let me just grieve for your mother before we discuss anything." John sighed and went over to talk to his sister. He wanted to get the subject of his father's relocation out of the way, so they could get their family house on the market and sold. Previously, Lorraine, John and Peter, their youngest son, had arranged for their father to move into Fosdyke residential home in Cleethorpes as soon as their mother had passed away. They had organised for Charles's piano to be allowed into the home so he would feel comfortable. The family organised everything without involving Charles, who, although angry, said nothing, as he did not want to accept the inevitable. After Mary's wake, the families and friends departed, leaving Charles alone. His daughter Lorraine offered to stay with him, but he declined the offer. The families had arranged to go round the next morning to help him move. Charles felt numb, confused and a little angry with his children, and they rushed to palm him off into some old folks' home. He poured himself a whisky and went over to his old Steinway, lifted the lid and started to play tunes that brought back fond memories, which he and Mary had shared. He recalled Mary's last words, "Life is too short to be sad." He played vigorously with that thought in mind. Charles played and drank whisky until he dozed off into a drunken stupor, slumped over his piano. John arrived mid-morning and went over to his father. Noticing the empty whisky bottle and knocked over glass, he gently shook his father awake and said, "I'll make a cup of tea, Dad. Why don't you go to bed and I'll bring one up for you?" Charles got unsteadily to his feet, went upstairs and got into bed, where he remained for the rest of the day. Family members turned up throughout the day to help with the move. Only a few personal items were allowed into the residential home. The rest of Charles and Mary's belongings and furniture were to be sold and the proceeds divided amongst the families. While the removal company were clearing the house, Charles remained in his bedroom. The house was now bare, apart from the bedroom furniture. The Rains family brought food for Charles throughout the day and offered to stay the night on a camp bed. Charles refused, and that night again drank himself into a stupor, gazing around his home and wanting desperately to join his beloved Mary. The following morning, John and Lorraine arrived to take Charles to the residential home. They led him out of the house and into John's car. Another knock on the door disturbed Charles's thoughts and brought him back into reality. He assumed that it was Mrs. Chew again, so he decided to ignore it. A small rotund man, who was as bald as a bell end, then walked in. "Charlie boy," shouted a jovial geriatric with a cheery grin, and went over to Charles. "I'm Steve. It's nice to meet you. Chewy told us you were coming. Come on, mate, let's go eat, and I'll introduce you to everyone." "I'm not hungry, but thanks anyway," said Charles, forcing a smile. "Come on, try some. The scran isn't too bad here, and tonight's barbecue night. A real treat," insisted Steve, as he put his arm round Charles' shoulder to coax him. He chuckled and joked, "I've been in mate here for 5 years, and I'm well known in most of the pubs around the area." Charles looked at this comical 7-year-old, who he thought resembled a Weeble toy. He realised that he was persistent and would not take no for an answer. The pair made their way into the dining hall, and Steve led Charles to 2 seats between 2 other elderly gentlemen. Track 2. Set within picturesque grounds on the southern end of the coastal town of Cleethorpes, Fosdyke residential home was built near a large, shallow, man-made boating lake, with 2 small islands at its centre. These served as a sanctuary for the colourful bird life inhabiting the area. It was an idyllic and tranquil location. The residence was fairly modern and had recently been converted from a guest house into a residential home by the present owners. The main residence was a 2-storey high building with 23 single-bedroom units. These studio apartments were 4 by 7 metres in size, with an ensuite WC. The resident would provide their own furniture, and a warden lived permanently on site. 2 other buildings were smaller and only single-storey. One was a kitchen and a communal dining area, which provided meals 3 times a day. The other building served as a recreation room, where the residents could congregate, organise activities, read books from a small library, and watch DVD movies on a large TV. This communal room also contained several smaller rooms, where residents could keep their other personal belongings locked away. Not a great deal happened at the home during the summer months. Most of the old folks would either stroll along the beach or relax in the gardens. It was a serene existence, and the residents varied. There were a few married couples, but it was mainly elderly single men and women, whose families had put them in the home because they felt they couldn't take care of themselves. The dining room was full of clatter and chatter as the kitchen staff stirred the residents with their barbecue ribs, and although some struggled to gnaw through the pork with their false gnashers, it didn't stop them giving the meat a damn good sucking. Fosdyke was a well-run and efficient residential home. Charles sat and surveyed the room and the people who were about to become his new neighbours. "Charlie, meet Wayne," said Steve as he sat back and the man leant over and extended his hand. Wayne appeared to be a Latino gentleman and looked a lot younger than his actual age of 70, with his black curly hair and boyish demeanour. "Hi, Charlie, I'm Wayne," he said, and shook Charles's hand. "It's Charles, not Charlie," said Charles. "What?" asked Wayne. "I said it's Charles, not Charlie," repeated Charles, louder. "What?" Wayne again asked, and then said, "I still have my own teeth." Steve laughed and said, "He's as deaf as a post, and he dyes his hair black." "What?" He then turned up the volume on his hearing aid. "Hello, Charles," said the man to his left in a chirpy Cockney accent. "I'm Elvin, but they call me Chippers." Charles introduced himself and noticed that Elvin had fingers missing as he shook his hand. Charles felt uneasy and tried not to stare at the digitally challenged hands. Steve interrupted and told him that he would meet the others later, but for now he had met the 3 friends who had become the most important part of his new life. "After we've finished eating, we can go to the rec room and see what you can do on that old piano," announced Steve. Charles felt a little better as he chomped away on his ribs and chatted to Steve, Wayne and Elvin. Steve pointed out several other individual residents and relayed some of their weird and wonderful foibles, such as Andrex Ethel, who had the habit of walking around with toilet paper stuck out of her knickers, and Boring Bill, who people tended to avoid as all he ever talked about was pigeons. Charles was eager to see his piano, and after they finished eating, the 4 went to the recreation room and over to his Steinway. "What can you play?" asked Steve, as Charles sat down on a stool, lifted the lid, and started to play the Sergei Taneyev concerto in E-flat. Several of the residents had made their way over to the recreation room, which was usually noisy as they chatted and played games or watched TV. There was silence as they listened intently, as Charles became engrossed in his music. After 10 minutes, Charles finished and stared at the piano keys, reminiscing over the tune, which was one of his and Mary's favourites. He languished in his own world, while the recreation room remained silent. After several minutes, the residents started to applaud. The room now had a dozen people who'd come to hear him play. However, his 3 new companions didn't appear impressed. Mabel, a sprightly 82-year-old, started to sing Lily of the Lamplight to herself and anyone who would listen. Steve then asked, "Do you know any rock and roll?" Charles looked at the 3. "No, sorry, I only know classical, but if you have some sheet music, maybe I can play some." Steve, Wayne and Elvin looked disappointed and started to talk amongst themselves. Charles again tinkled on the piano keys and started to play a short Mozart piece, but stopped when he was interrupted by Mabel. She barraged him with requests, so he played White Cliffs of Dover, with Mabel happily shrieking along. The 3 friends finished their discussion amongst themselves. Steve put his hand on Charles's shoulder, and with a mischievous grin, and through Mabel's toneless warble, said, "Don't worry, Charlie boy, me and the lads still have high hopes for you." Steve, Elvin and Wayne went over to a room, unlocked the door and went inside. Charles watched them bemused as he continued to try to match a chord to Mabel's screeching. The 3 emerged from the room several minutes later. First Steve, who carried a beaten-up guitar and a small speaker amp. Then Elvin, who carried a large double bass, along with a microphone stand and various wires. And finally Wayne, who had a round black box that contained the snare drum and bass cymbals, part of his Mapex drum kit. The crowd within the recreation room saw the trio, and a look of horror came across their faces. They'd seen this before, and to the poor old folk it meant the return of the terrifying torture, which they had all hoped had been firmly locked away in the past. However, with the arrival of Charles, it appeared to have resurfaced. The room was plunged into panic, as Steve, with the devil's glint in his eye, snarled, "Right, you old fogies." He paused for effect as the crowd trembled and then announced, "Strat's back." Mabel shrieked, Ethel ran around trailing toilet tissue, Boring Bill headed for the door, and Wally, another resident, made a desperate plea. "Somebody go get Chewy, quickly." Steve plugged his guitar in. Elvin stood to the side of his double bass, and Wayne set up his drum kit, while the other residents scarpered. Charles was sat at his piano looking confused as Mrs. Chew rushed into the room and hurried over to the fore. "You promised not to set up again after the last incident and our previous conversation," shouted a perturbed Mrs. Chew. "Just making our new friend feel at home," says Steve, "and besides, the rec room's empty, so I won't be disturbing anybody." "It's empty because you scared everybody away, the same as before," Mrs. Chew said, exasperated. "This time it'll be different. We're playing along with Charles's classical shit," says Steve, and turned to Charles. "Play some of your music, Charlie boy." Charles was dumbfounded, but started to play. Mrs. Chew stood with her hands on her hip and listened to Charles play a melancholy tune. She knew she was being manipulated by Steve yet again, but he was the boss's father, so she couldn't say a great deal. She gave them a stern look and told them, "You've got 1 hour and then put everything away." She turned and stormed out of the recreation room. "Good. Chew's pissed off. Now we can start," Steve said as he tapped Charles on the shoulder and announced, "and we can get down to play some serious music." A smile beamed across his face and he growled, "Rock and roll." He started to play, and Elvin and Wayne joined in with Johnny Be Good. Steve sang and rocked away like a teenager. He shook and swayed in front of Charles, who silently sat at his piano, while Steve banged out his rendition of the rock and roll classic. Elvin plucked his double bass, although he struggled, as he had not put on his little falsies, and Wayne thumped out a beat in his drums, which unfortunately wasn't for the same song. Charles listened and thought he could hear his eardrums starting to bleed. This wasn't music to his ears, it sounded more like cats being murdered, but being polite, he let them finish their rendition. "What do you think, Charlie? Could you add that little certain something to make any improvements?" asked Steve. A shotgun came to Charles's mind. He looked at the smiling faces of the proud old wrinkled rockers, and recalled what Mary had always told him about there not being good or bad music, only music that people either liked or disliked according to individual taste. "Maybe," said Charles, and added, "you just all need to come together a little more in the harmony, and you need a little structure." "Can you help us with that?" asked Elvin. Steve interrupted. "Yeah, Charlie boy, you can help us and join our band, and we'll give you a cool stage name." Charles considered, and while the other three started to discuss their song, he thought about this proposal and his new life. Charles knew this would be a challenge, but to have something to keep him interested and amused with this motley band of geriatrics could be fun. "Okay," said Charles. "I think I can help you, but please don't call me Charlie." "What do you want us to call you then?" asked Steve. "My name is Charles, so how about you just call me Charles?" "I'm Strat, Elvin's Chippers, and Deaf Boy over there is Sticks, so we can't just call you boring old Charles," announced Steve, smiling. "Nobby," interrupted Elvin. "What?" said Steve, Charles and Wayne. "Nobby," repeated Elvin, and went on to explain. "In the military, anyone with a surname Clark was always called Nobby Clark." Charles remembered his childhood, and he had heard people refer to his father as Brigadier Nobby Clark, although unsure why. "Okay," said Charles, as he looked into the smiling faces of the elderly men. "Nobby it is, then." Charles looked at Elvin, who was fitting what looked like homemade prosthetics to his missing finger stumps. "I'll sound better playing with these on," said Elvin, as he waved his small Edward Scissorhands attachments. One had an index finger and a thumb-shaped object set at various angles, which Charles noticed seemed to be perfect shape and design for plucking the strings of the double bass. His left hand's prosthetic had just one small tube, which would be ideal for covering the fret strings at the neck of the instrument to form chords. "Ingenious," thought Charles. And as Elvin noticed Charles's interest, said, "These are me little falsies. I made a few of these for different occasions. I call these me guitar falsies. I also have me eating falsies, car-playing falsies, lady-pleasing falsies, and many more," said Elvin in his cheery Cockney twang. Charles winced and hoped that Elvin wasn't going to play again. The four old musicians stood at the side of Charles's piano, and Steve said, "Well, lads, we have 1 hour, so what shall we play?" "Perhaps Nobby could suggest something," said Elvin. Charles cringed, looked at the eager trio, and said, "I suppose our first step would be to find something that we can all play together. I don't know any rock music, and I don't imagine any of you have any sheet music for me to follow, so maybe we should start with the basics." "Sheet music?" laughed Steve. "I don't reckon that any of us could even read sheet music." "I can," chipped in Elvin. "Me too," added Wayne, as he sat behind his drum kit. Steve looked shocked, especially at Wayne, not only because he had heard him, as Steve knew he was only selectively deaf, but what shocked him was that he had known Wayne for almost 2 years, and although he could beat out a good rhythm, he had never suspected this old Canadian had any musical education. Wayne smiled and added, "I've also written a few songs, but I've never had anyone to sing or perform them with." "You're a dark horse, Logan," said Steve. "Perhaps I could take a look at your songs. We may as well lend them. At least we'll be on a level playing field, said Charles. What? Asked Wayne. Charles repeated his request, but spoke louder. Okay, said Wayne. They're in my room. Maybe tomorrow. Charles wanted to find out more about his new friends, partly because he was interested, but more importantly to fill an hour to stop them playing another awful song. Are any of you married? Charles inquired. No, said Elvin. My wife passed away 4 years ago. I'm single. I got divorced years ago and played the field, Steve announced. Charles missed Mary, so he continued with the conversation to take his mind off his beloved wife. How about you, Wayne? Are you married? Wayne unfortunately lost his wife 20 years ago, Steve said, and shouted at Wayne. Didn't you, mate? Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, Wayne. What did she die from? Inquired the concerned Charles, loudly. What? Asked Wayne, who looked confused, and then replied, My wife didn't die. Elvin and Steve laughed. She didn't die, chortled Elvin and continued. He just lost her. What? Said Wayne, again fiddling with his hearing aid. Wayne was popular among the female residents of Fosdyke, and he flocked round him like a Liverpool postman on Gyro Day. Even Mrs. Chew had a crush on old Wayne, even though she was married and 20 years his junior. Wayne told Charles that he had resided at Fosdyke now for 2 years. Originally from Ontario, Canada, this slim, dark, curly-haired 71-year-old man had settled in Cleethorpes 15 years ago, after spending many years trying to trace his long-lost love, Julie. He explained that his family owned a successful Italian restaurant chain in Canada. However, he had set his sights on becoming a musician, and left the family home on his 16th birthday, and joined the Alex Gilroy Band, a 7-piece swing band. He had studied music at school, and although he could play keyboard instruments, his forte in love was for the drums. He'd been given the nickname Sticks, as he always carried around a set of drumsticks and would tap anything that he felt could offer a beat, bottles, cans, people's heads, etc. He toured as a drummer with the band throughout the Canada and remained there for several years, until the rock and roll revolution hit America in the late 50s, and he relocated to the US. He joined Johnny and the Jeepsters, a rock and roll and skiffle band. During the 1980s, various other forms of music pushed out the old rock and roll, so he decided to try his hand at rock music. He teamed up with a band called Smoking Heads, and dropped his nickname Sticks, as he felt it no longer cool and belonged in the rock and roll era. The band never became famous to any degree, but had a small fan base, and he performed many gigs around the world, touring several countries. The loud music started to take its toll on Wayne's hearing, and it became increasingly difficult to hear the music as each tour went on. The group did a tour of the UK in the mid-1980s. The band had decided to get rid of Wayne, as due to his age he no longer fitted with their hard rock image, and this was to be the last tour with the band. They had a gig in the Sheffield Arena, and it was there he met and fell in love with Julie, an attractive 30-year-old woman from Cleethorpes. He became besotted with Julie and invited her to the United States, so they could be together. Julie accepted and moved to the US. The life was great at first. Wayne was working as a session musician and started to write and sell some of his songs. As his deafness became progressively worse, his sessions got shorter. He became miserable and angry and vented his anger out on Julie. He turned into a violent drunkard and Julie felt dejected. One night he came home spannered. Julie and belongings were gone. He tried frantically to search for Julie and arrived in Cleethorpes of the winter of 1991 and tried to trace down the family. He spent years on this plight and had been searching and hoping ever since. Never giving up hope, he bought himself a house in Cleethorpes, but after a few years his deafness had become a burden and he'd been robbed several times. He became afraid to stay at home and felt too old to return to Canada or the States. Cleethorpes has become his home and he still had a flicker of hope that he would find Julie. He sold his house and decided to move into a residential home. He searched around the area and stumbled across Fosdyke. Wayne finished his tale, and Charles, remembering the start of Wayne's story, asked, I thought you had dropped the name Sticks, so how come they call you Sticks now? Wayne looked at Steve and frowned. It's that slaphead's fault, he said. He told Charles that he'd kept a few mementos from his past days as a musician. One of these was a tattoo or framed poster from his days with Johnny and the Jeepsters. Steve giggled as the story was about to unfold. One day when Wayne was getting ready to go to the recreation room to rehearse, Steve knocked, walked into his room and noticed the faded yellow poster. Steve went over, looked at the picture and asked him about the band. Steve had heard of them and was impressed that Wayne had actually played with the Jeepsters. Wayne hadn't previously divulged too much information about his past, so he mumbled, I played with them for a short while. Steve continued asking more questions, so Wayne fiddled with his hearing aid and feigned deafness. Steve studied the poster and read the band's line-up. Wayne Sticks Logan, he chuckled as he came across Wayne listed as a drummer. Wayne cursed under his breath as he realised that Steve had found out his nickname, and Sticks was reborn. The four didn't play any more as they listened to Wayne's tale, much to the relief of Charles. After the hour was up, Wayne, Steve and Elvin packed away their instruments. Steve suggested they should take a walk to the Pavilion, which was the closest pub, for a beer. Charles didn't feel in the mood, but after the three persisted and wanted to hear more about his new friends, he agreed, and they headed for the pub. The Pavilion was a large public house set back from the boating lake, within a small patch of land with several trees surrounding it. It was a popular watering hole during the summer months. With the lake in full view, the outside seating area was very picturesque. While the four sat and enjoyed the beer, Charles asked Steve how he came to be at Fosdyke. Elvin and Wayne looked dismal, as they knew what Steve's story would lead up to, and they prepared accordingly as Steve related his tale. Steve told Charles that he originally came from Scunthorpe, and he decided that he wanted to be a musician during the 1960s. He bought an acoustic guitar and learned to play. He saved his wages and upgraded to electric Fender Stratocaster. He and his two friends got together and formed Strat and the Steelers, and performed in several pubs and clubs throughout the Lincolnshire area. Steve held high aspirations of being a rock star, but because the Steelers were crap, and he met Jane, who he married, he decided to settle down. The couple had a daughter, Lucy, and Steve became a happy and contented family man for many years, until Jane had an affair with one of his friends and he divorced. Lucy was 19 when Steve and Jane split. She was at university studying to become a doctor. The split affected Steve badly, and he spent the next few years skipping work and getting drunk. In his 40s, his life seemed to be going nowhere, and, constantly depressed, he decided to change his lifestyle. One day he awoke, withdrew his savings, went to a travel agent and booked a flight to Australia. He took with him several items of clothes and his old Fender Stratocaster. He told nobody and severed all ties. Steve spent the next 20 years in Australia. He moved from town to town, city to city, and job to job. He occasionally played in local bars for drinks and food, and lived the carefree life he'd always wanted, with no ties. Steve now approached 60, and decided to find a female companion to take care of him in his old age. Steve knew that if he stayed in Australia or returned to the UK, he would be alone, as being a short, fat, bald 6-year-old wouldn't be a Western woman's idea of a great catch. Besides, he didn't fancy getting lumber with an old troll, so he decided to try the Philippines. Wayne and Elvin knew what was about to come next. They had heard this many times before, as a prelude to one of Steve's repeated tales. Wayne turned off his hearing aid and Elvin sighed as Steve said, "When I was in the Philippines." While Wayne and Elvin cringed, Steve continued with his story. It was shortly after he arrived in Manila that Steve had his biggest regret. He wished he'd come sooner, as the Southeast Asian adventure made his head spin. This fabulous new culture and lifestyle drew Steve into a magical existence. He settled in Angeles City, a raucous, sex-filled sin city in the Philippines. He worked in a few live music venues, and although receiving very little pay, he reaped the other benefits of being a Western musician. He lived and parted in a carefree existence. His desire to finally settle down with a woman diminished, as there were too many to choose from, and he chopped and changed many ladies over the years. Steve spent several years in this blissful existence, until one day he developed a severe pain in the left side of his abdomen. Not having much money, the lady he was with at the time took him along to a local quack, who performed an emergency hernia operation. His condition improved, although it slowed him down, and made him realise that although a hernia was not life-threatening, what would happen if he developed something more serious? Who could he turn to, and who would look after him, with him having no money? He therefore decided to contact his daughter, Lucy, who he'd had no contact with for over 20 years. He contacted the UK Embassy in Manila to assist him. Steve continued with his wild and carefree life for several months, until the embassy contacted him and informed him that they'd tracked down his daughter, Dr. Lucy Fosdyke, MD, a general practitioner with a practice in Cleethorpes. Lucy and her husband Bernard, an accountant, visited Steve in Angeles. Steve and his middle-aged daughter had a tearful reunion. Lucy was concerned and wanted her father to return to the UK. Steve refused at first until several weeks after Lucy had returned to England, he got rushed into a local hospital. The hospital was poorly equipped with archaic medical facilities, but they found a large mass in Steve's abdomen, which the Filipino doctor suspected was a malignant tumour. Sorry about this. I hope you enjoyed this little snippet. Don't despair. If you want to listen to the book in its entirety, you can either buy it at cdbaby.com, or if you don't want to pay for it, just go to my website at www.buddhasauthor.com, go to my contact page, send me your email address, and I'll send you the whole version in the Dropbox, because that's the kind and generous person that I am, and I'm even prepared to forfeit a pair of dapper new flip-flops for your total enjoyment. Thank you all very much for listening.